Some say that it's only a game, and an odd one at that, involving a stick, a ball, and a hole in the ground. Where it began, no one knows. Its origin is lost in the mists of time. But its soul is timeless.
There's not a game you can name that is as varied, as complex, as exalted one moment and painful the next as golf. It's a game where you go from immense highs to immense lows, and you're trying to beat a foe who doesn't exist.
For this is a game shared by fathers and sons, on fields touched with beauty by the hand of God, and others nurtured with love by mankind.
You can have the most beautiful basketball arena, stadium, football ground, cricket ground, soccer stadium, and it doesn't compare when the camera looks down along that stretch of beach at Pebble or around the 17-mile drive or anywhere where golf is played, even if it's up against the county jailhouse.
Its lure is difficult to define, impossible to exaggerate. An obsession that can begin at any age and last a lifetime. It was that way for two Texans, born the same year. They learned the game in the same caddy yard as boys, hoisted the same trophies as men. This was almost a part-time passion for a Southern gentleman who was equally enthralled by literature and the law, and a brief but glorious career for a gifted woman whose athletic prowess has never been equaled.
I think when you do see a truly accomplished player or a professional hit a golf ball for the first time, it takes your breath away in a way that other sports don't. There's something about golf that's truly awe-inspiring.
Today, hardly a country remains untouched by this glorious epidemic that is golf.
Wherever you go, the game is like it's like a church. I mean, it's a philosophy of life. It's a religion almost. I mean, it's a gospel of golf, and it's everywhere and nowhere. The game is within us.
Its transfixing appeal has captured all. The feats of a steelworker's son once inspired the hopes of a pharmacist's son. And two youngsters, born decades apart, ignited the spirit of their generations. Where it began, no one knows. What it has become, no one imagined. Where did this game of golf begin? Well, it appears that every corner of the world played some part in its evolution. It might have all begun in an alley near the Roman Forum, where soldiers kept in fighting trim by playing a game called Paganica. Or on a hillside near the Great Wall, where illustrated scrolls from the Ming Dynasty depict Suigan, a walking game that may have been exported by silk traders in the late Middle Ages. A stained glass window in England's Gloucester Cathedral, dating from the mid-14th century, shows a figure wielding a stick in the middle of a distinctly golf-like backswing. Did it begin beside a country road in Normandy, where the French enjoyed jeu de maille, a curious game blending billiards, croquet, and miniature golf? Or is golf linked to Belgium and the cross-country team game called Chole, which was played with heavy iron clubs and egg-shaped wooden balls? In London courtyards, Pall Mall became the rage of the ruling class. We know King Charles I was an avid Pall Maller. In 1629, the Court of St. James included an impressive 1,000-yard-long area for royal play. But perhaps the best argument for golf's true forefather comes from the people across the North Sea, the Dutch. As far back as the 13th century, they played a game mostly in winter on the ice that bears a more than passing similarity to golf. And the name of that game? Golf. Richly detailed landscape paintings show us that golf remained popular in Holland for at least 400 years. But no matter where the seeds of golf were sown, without question, it was the Scots who gave the game its character. This game has always been dangerously addictive. The first written evidence of golf is a parliamentary decree by King James II of Scotland banning it. In 1457, he declared that football and golf be utterly cried doon and not use it. Back then, the Scots were at war with England, and the principal weapons were the bow and arrow. But it seems the Scottish lads had been neglecting their archery practice in favor of golf. When James IV married the daughter of England's King Henry IV, the conflict with the English suddenly ended, and so did the conflict with golfers. James IV was the first of a long line of royals who took to the links. Legend holds that in 1567, Mary, Queen of Scots, was so smitten with the game that she played the day after her husband, Lord Darnley, was murdered. But in those days, golf was an informal, almost free-form activity with no rules and few guidelines. All evidence suggests that the Scots played this way for at least 3 centuries. Inevitably, a desire arose to determine the best golfer in the land.
The first competition was in March 1744 at Leith Links, and this was actually a group of golfers had persuaded the Town Council of Edinburgh to present a silver club to be challenged for every year, which is very much along the lines of the archery competitions run by the Royal Company of Archers. And furthermore, that the way that the prize was given, that the winner appended a ball to the club, is following the lines of appending medals to the silver arrows. And indeed, the first winner of the competition, John Rattray, was a champion archer and was well used to these kinds of events. And indeed, the Royal Company of Archers used to shoot a lot of their competitions over Leith Links because it was public ground.
But on that day in 1744, something even more important happened. Golf was played for the first time according to a set of rules. They were admirably brief, just 13 points in all, and admirably charitable as well, with no penalties for violations. For example, if your ball is stopped by any person, horse, or dog, the ball must be played as it lies. If your club snaps and breaks during the downswing, you are deemed to have made a stroke. And a rule that remained unchanged for decades: you must tee your ball within a club length of the hole. Imagine how shaggy those early putting greens must have been. Indeed, golf's first playing fields bore little resemblance to the manicured meadows we enjoy today.
When you think about golf in the 18th century, you have to dismiss all the ideas that you have of the game today in terms of how the courses looked. They're being played over common land, which is to say, I mean, the links is the wasted land between the coast and the arable land. It's very, very rough. What you would today call rough, they would have thought as being rather nice fairway.
Yes, those original courses were less fashioned by man than formed by nature.
I believe that the original hole was made by rabbits. The male rabbit of a family will choose the center of a nice grassy patch, and he will scrape a little hole and urinate in it to mark his territory, and I believe that that was the first golf hole, because it was always on the best bit of grass in the neighborhood.
Rabbits and sheep also took a lead role in course design by burrowing their way into the turf for protection against the elements. Over time, the wind enlarged those burrows, and golf's most formidable hazard, the sand bunker, took shape. Now remember, the game was played for about 400 years before any human got around to cutting the grass.
The courses were not only set out very roughly, but because they're being played on common land, they vary tremendously in their size, because that depends on how much land is available for them. So, for example, at St Andrews was originally 11 holes played twice for 22 holes. Leith was 5 holes. North Berwick 7, Montrose 20-something.
In time, of course, a standard would be set, and the authority for that decree would come from the abiding bedrock of golf administration. It is nestled quietly on a remote tip of Scotland's northeast coast, the unassuming little town of St Andrews. It would seem a most unlikely seat of authority of any kind. Yet, it had been the ecclesiastical center of Scotland since the 12th century, a religious mecca of equal stature to Canterbury in England. It was also the site of the oldest university in Scotland. Written evidence of golf at St Andrews dates from 1552, but most historians agree the game was played there in one form or another for 300 years before that. The golfers of St Andrews did not organize themselves into a club until 1754, 10 years after the men of Leith. But it was almost inevitable that this place would assume an administrative role. The first step came in 1764, when the St Andrians made a drastic revision in their hallowed playground. The old course was comprised of 22 holes, 11 holes played out to the Eden estuary, and 11 played back to the same hole in the ground. For no known reason, they decided to eliminate the portion of the course which occupied the land that ran from just outside the cathedral wall and extended down to near the present site of the Royal and Ancient Clubhouse. This eliminated the first 2 holes played out and the last 2 holes played back, thus reducing the St Andrews round from 22 holes to 18, which would become the standard throughout the world. Over the next several years, the society would attract the best and brightest golfers, frame a new set of rules, and generally position itself as the last word on all questions related to the game. In 1834, England's King William IV became the patron of the society and declared it the Royal and Ancient Golf Club. It was official. St Andrews was now the home of golf. Back in 1834, there wasn't much golf to oversee. A total of only 17 clubs existed, 14 of them in Scotland, 2 in England, and 1 in, of all places, India, where a group of British colonials formed the Royal Calcutta Golf Club. In all the world, fewer than 1,000 people could call themselves golfers. The game was not growing. It was shrinking. Once the recreation for the masses, golf had eroded into a diversion for the wealthy and privileged. Why? Well, above all, because of the golf ball. That's right, because of the ball. The very first golfers are believed to have used balls made of boxwood, and if they were a bit lacking in sophistication, they were at least affordable. But in the early 17th century, a new ball was put in play. Called the feathery, its leather cover was stuffed with one top hat full of goose or chicken feathers. The feathery provided good resilience and distance, and the strongest players could hit it over 200 yards.
The making of the feathery ball was a long, difficult and skillful process. The materials involved were rawhide, usually bull or horsehide being preferred, and a hat full of feathers. The material was cut into 1 strip and 2 circles for each ball. The formers were used to punch the relevant number of holes for stitching through the material. The sections were stitched together using a waxed thread. The feathers themselves were soaked to give a material that rather like rice pudding, but this went in through the hole here. It's a very difficult process, using a small stuffing irons for a start, right through to a big chest press. Once the ball had been fully stuffed, the finishing seam across here was stitched. Whilst it was still wet, it was hammered into as round a shape as possible. During the drying process, the leather would shrink and the feathers would expand, and that would create a tight, finished ball.
Golf ball making had become a fine art.
Even the best craftsmen could only put together 3 or 4 of these a day, and golfers needed 3 or 4 of these around. They'd get waterlogged, they'd get damaged, and they were extremely impractical, but quite expensive as well. In fact, golf balls, feather balls at that point, were more expensive than golf clubs, and it made it more of a game for the rich. Only the rich could afford to buy these.
Clearly, a ball was needed whose performance, durability, and affordability would attract more people to the game. In the mid-19th century, that miracle ball arrived. It came from the Far East in the form of gutta percha, the coagulated milk of a Malayan gum tree.
The precise origin of the gutta percha ball is a matter of some dispute, but the most exotic, if not authentic, claim is the one involving the Hindu statue. In the mid-19th century, James Patterson, a Scottish missionary based in India, sent a statue to his brother Robert. The statue had been cushioned for shipment with chunks and chips of gutta percha, a moldable substance that so fascinated young Robert that he first tried to resole his boot with it and then fashion it into a golf ball.
The substance was exported in a sheet that the ball maker cut into strips, softened in hot water, and rounded into a ball by hand. The ball was then dropped into cold water to harden. It was as simple as that. The first gutties brought mixed reaction. They were rounder and as smooth as billiard balls, but they were tough to get airborne and tended to duck in flight. Willie Dunn, a professional at Musselburgh, was so disgusted with the balls that he gave them to his caddies. But in short time, he noticed the caddies were hitting the gutty with more authority than he could muster from a feathery. The reason? Once it had a few nicks and scuffs on its face from iron shots, the gutty flew like an eagle. And so the second generation became the hand-hammered gutty with aerodynamic markings pre-chiseled on its surface.
The gutta percha ball outperformed the feather ball in virtually every way. It outdistanced the feather ball, it had better control, and was far more durable. But the best thing about it was that it was so much easier to produce. The average gutta percha ball maker could make 100 of these a day, whereas a feather ball maker could only produce 3 or 4. This made it far more affordable to the common golfer at that period and inched the game away from the aristocracy.
A gutta percha boom had reignited the game. By 1890, the smattering of golf societies in Great Britain grew to 387 clubs playing over 140 different courses. But the gutty's arrival was met with alarm and opposition by the feathery makers. Chief among them was Alan Robertson of St. Andrews, the game's first Renaissance man. A small, stubborn, sturdily built fellow with red-brown whiskers, Alan was the last of 6 generations of club and ball-making Robertsons.
He was known as the world's first golf professional. Really a tag he got from the other players of that time. They all rebelled against Robertson. He was far superior to them in a lot of ways, partly because he had the time, because of his business, to actually practice his game. To give you an example, the St. Andrews Society of Golfers used to put up what you would call kitty, money, or the pots they called it, for the players, the professional caddies of that time in the spring and the autumn meetings, to go out and simply play against each other. Robertson always won the money, and the other players complained that it was unjust, that he was that good.
He was probably the game's first course architect and green superintendent. But ball making was Robertson's livelihood, and the gutty threatened it. He became so bitter that he bought up all gutties found in the bushes of the old course and burned them. Robertson made his employees promise never to use them. One day, while playing the old course, his chief apprentice, Tom Morris, ran out of balls and was forced to play a gutty. Robertson witnessed this untimely indiscretion.
Somebody in Devilment shouted across to Alan, "Tom's playing great with a gutter." And Tom said, "Fine, I could tell he wasn't pleased." And when Alan got back, Tom was sacked.
In time, even Robertson gave in to the gutty, happily finding that he could produce more balls and income with much less work. And to his credit, he was among the first to realize that the new ball required a new set of clubs. Golf had been played with essentially the same implements for more than 2 centuries. The woods, which far outnumbered the irons, had shafts made of hazelwood or ash with heads of apple or thornwood. The 2 pieces were carefully spliced together and then glued and bound with several windings of tarred twine. The biggest wallop was packed by the play club, a long-nosed weapon with little or no loft in its tiny 1-inch high hitting area. Its shaft was 45 inches long. about the same as today's drivers. But the shaft met the club head at an angle of 120 degrees as the early golfers stood well away from the ball and attacked with a flat, sweeping swing. The sole of the club face was reinforced with the most extravagant material, a strip of ram's horn. A variety of lofted woods called spoons were used for approach play, from the long spoon for distance shots to the baffing spoon for raising the ball from poor lies and over hazards. Putters were also made of wood, and a single golfer might carry as many as 3 of them for a variety of situations. Iron clubs, being hazardous to the health of the feather ball, were reserved for the direst of circumstances. The bunker iron and rut iron were bizarre-looking things that suited the nasty assignments for which they were intended. But as the balls evolved, so did the clubs.
More irons came into play because you didn't have to worry about mishitting a feather ball and feathers flying. The new gutta-percha ball could withstand greater impact. The shafts became softer. They used softer wood like American hickory, and the shafts were also a little bit shorter, so the swings became more upright than they were in the featherball period.
The club heads changed to a softer beechwood to better absorb the hit and became shorter and thicker to pack more punch directly behind the ball. The ultimate effect of this was to lessen the strain on the weakest part of the club, the spliced area just above the club head. Meanwhile, iron clubs came into their own. No longer a menace to the ball, they became the preferred implements for approach shots of every kind. There was such a demand for irons that several Scottish blacksmiths abandoned their other areas of trade and took up club making full-time, calling themselves cleek makers. The cleek, equivalent to the modern 2 or 3 iron, was the first to appear. It was followed swiftly by the progressively more lofted mid-iron, mashie, and niblick, all of which led to perhaps the most practical invention of all, a simple sailcloth golf bag. Alan Robertson embraced the new irons both as a craftsman and a player, and was probably the first to master the run-up shot with a cleek. At St Andrews in 1858, he ran his approach to the 18th green, then rolled in his gutty for a birdie at a 79, making him the first man to break 80 on the old course. A year later, he fell sick with hepatitis and died at the age of 44. Among the tributes to him, they may toll the bells and shut up their shops in St Andrews, for their greatest is gone.
Alan's death did provide some kind of a void, but very soon there were a lot of young up-and-coming players, and also Tom Morris and Willie Park Sr., with their rivalry and matches, were creating an enormous amount of interest. And it was possible for all this to gel about 1852, when the railways first arrived at St Andrews, linking it up with Edinburgh and Leith and with Glasgow and Prestwick, so that all these players could get together from one side of Scotland to the other.
So in 1860, the Prestwick Club announced a tournament for professionals that would become the forerunner of today's championship golf. To the winner, they offered a unique red Moroccan leather belt embroidered with silver medallions. Permanent possession of the belt would go to whoever won the title 3 years in succession.
Only 8 men entered, and it was taken that Tom Morris would win at Prestwick, his home course, but in fact Willie Park Sr. did with a total of 174 over 36 holes. Tom Morris took 176, and both these scores were very high. This encouraged amateurs to reckon that they might be able to compete, and so in 1861 some amateurs were included, and so the tournament has remained open to this day.
Tom Morris won that second championship and would split 7 of the first 8 with Willie Park. When Morris won for the last time in 1868, at the age of 46, he became and still remains the oldest British Open champion. 1 year later, the title was won by a lad of 17 years, who became and still remains the youngest British Open champion. And his name also was Tom Morris. This legendary father-son pair would forever be known as Old and Young Tom. Young Tom Morris was as wonderfully gifted a player as the game had ever seen, or ever would.
It must have been interesting for Old Tom to watch, because he was sent down to Prestwick in 1851 when young Tom was just born. Watched him as a boy rabbiting about that course, practicing with an old sawn-off club to seeing this big athletic swing when he was 13, 14 years old. I mean, he hit the ball with such venom on his long shots that his Balmoral bonnet used to fall off the top of his head. But it wasn't just the power of the boy. As Old Tom said, his putting was heaven sent.
In truth, his game had no weaknesses. He proved it by successfully defending his title in 1869 and then taking permanent possession of the belt with a third straight win in 1870. There was a gap in 1871 because no one came forward to offer a prize to replace the belt. Then in 1872, a silver claret jug was presented jointly by St Andrews, Musselburgh, and Prestwick. When play resumed, Tommy picked up where he'd left off, winning the title for a fourth time. But we'll never know how many more he would have won. In September of 1875, his wife and newborn baby had died in childbirth, a blow from which young Tom never fully recovered. 3 months later, on Christmas Day, he passed away mysteriously in his sleep at the age of 24. The clinical cause of his death was most likely pneumonia, but in the lore of golf, young Tom Morris died of a broken heart. Old Tom would outlive his son by 33 years, and for the last half of his life, he returned to his native St Andrews as the first resident professional to the Royal and Ancient Golf Club. With his long gray beard, tweed cap, and ever-present pipe, Tom Morris was a familiar figure to all who passed by his shop near the 18th green. One of those visitors during the summer of 1887 was a gentleman named Robert Lockhart. Lockhart had emigrated to the United States, but his job as a linen merchant took him back and forth to his home soil frequently. He decided to introduce the game to his friends in America. So in Tom Morris's shop, he purchased 6 clubs and 24 gutta-percha balls. On the morning of George Washington's birthday in 1888, Lockhart's friend and fellow Scotsman John Reed assembled with 5 other gentlemen in a cow pasture in Yonkers, New York, and they gave golf a try. All 6 became instant converts. In the fall of that year, they assembled at Reed's home and founded a club, which in honor of the home of golf, they named the St Andrews Golf Club.
Well, there was good evidence that golf was played in the colonies as early as the mid-18th century in places like Savannah and Charleston, South Carolina, and even West Virginia. But most golf historians would say that the true beginning of American golf as we know it took place November 14th, 1888 at the estate of John Reed in Yonkers, New York. And Reed must be viewed as the father of American golf.
They called Reed's golfing pilgrims the Apple Tree Gang, after the old tree that served as their makeshift clubhouse. They sat on a wooden bench that circled the trunk. In its branches, the members hung their coats, their lunches, and a wicker basket holding several pints of Scotland's other gift to the world. Apple trees were the defining element of the St Andrews course that overlooked the Hudson River. Perched on a 34-acre orchard, the trees were so imposing that many newcomers assumed them to be integral features of any reputable course.
One story of American golf involved a Judge O'Brien, and he'd played all of 1 round at St Andrews on the apple tree orchard. And he traveled out to eastern Long Island to play Shinnecock Hills. And he played the course, which was dunesland, windswept, treeless. And afterwards he was asked his opinion of Shinnecock Hills, and he said, "That's not a golf course, it has no apple trees on it."
But other courses were sprouting in America, with and without apple trees, and they were sprouting quickly. Within 5 years of the founding of St Andrews, dozens of clubs had opened, aided by a steady stream of emigrant Scottish professionals. A standing joke of the era was the availability of a club professional's job for anyone coming off the boat with the name Willie and a sufficiently thick Scottish brogue. Willie Campbell went to Brookline in Massachusetts. Willie Dunn went to Shinnecock. Willie Anderson to Appowamus in New York, and Willie Smith to Midlothian in Illinois. The tiny Scottish town of Carnoustie alone would ship more than 250 men to golf professional jobs at American clubs. Meanwhile, one fellow went the other way. Charles Blair MacDonald, the son of a wealthy Chicagoan, sailed across the sea to St Andrews in 1872. The day after he arrived, he was taken to old Tom Morris's shop, where his grandfather bought him a set of clubs. Within a short time, the youngster was spending every spare moment playing the old course and listening to the great players of the day. By the time MacDonald returned home, America had the golf bug. In 1894, the best amateurs assembled at the Newport Country Club in Rhode Island to determine a national champion. CB was the man to beat, but he did not win. MacDonald later protested that a proper championship should not be a matter of who takes the fewest strokes. It should be decided by match play. Well, the following month he got his wish when the St Andrews Golf Club held a second amateur championship at match play.
But he lost because he was out late night before, didn't get much sleep, and was given some advice on what to take as an antidote for his late night. And he was okay through the morning round, but in the afternoon round he let it get away from him.
Once again, CB argued that the result was invalid because one club may not presume to run a national championship.
Which meant that in Charles Blair MacDonald's eyes, he had not lost a national championship because there wasn't one.
MacDonald's gripes were largely self-serving, but he was a man with a commanding presence, broad-shouldered, mustached, well-spoken, egotistical, and humorless. And he got his points across to the right people.
Well, after misfiring on running 2 national championships, the leadership of American golf realized that there was a need for a central authority for golf in this country. So the 5 leading clubs at the time gathered at the Calumet Club in December 22nd, 1894, and they created what was to be the U.S. Golf Association. There were a number of influential people at that meeting: Lawrence Curtis from the Country Club, Henry Talmadge from St. Andrews, and of course Charles Blair MacDonald from Chicago Golf Club. MacDonald was a very strong-willed individual. In fact, the early part of American golf, he was American golf. And you would think that he would have been the odds-on favorite to be named the first president of the USGA. Who knows why, but perhaps because he was so strong-willed and perhaps dogmatic, that honor fell to someone else, and it was Theodore Havemeyer from Newport Country Club. Theodore Havemeyer was also known as the Sugar King. He had a lot of money, and that came in very handy in the first few years of the USGA.
A year later, MacDonald got what he really wanted, a victory in the USGA's first amateur championship. It was held at Newport in October, having been pushed back a month so as not to intrude on a more important event, the America's Cup race. 29 gentlemen golfers took part, and MacDonald blazed to a 12-11 victory over Charles Sands, a young tennis buff who had entered the championship on a lark, having played golf for all of 3 months. On the next day, a much quieter event came to pass. Horace Rawlins, a 21-year-old Englishman, bettered a field of 9 professionals and 1 amateur to become the first United States Open champion. Now it is perhaps golf's most coveted title, but back then, the U.S. Open was a little more than an afterthought. C.B. MacDonald's breakthrough was also his swan song. He would never win again, but he would have a lasting influence on the game.
C.B. MacDonald was really America's first golf architect. In fact, he's the one who coined the phrase golf architect. The 18-hole course that he did at Chicago Golf Club was laid out really as a seaside links, even though it was over 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean, and really was America's first 18-hole golf course. But his real masterpiece was on the natural links land of eastern Long Island in New York, which in typical McDonald pomposity he called the National Golf Links of America. He engineered that course really to replicate many of the great shots and features of great old British holes, including his beloved St. Andrews. And when National Golf Links opened in 1911, it really set a new standard for American golf courses. And even today, it's considered one of the top courses in America and really in the world.
Inside the clubhouse is a life-size bronze statue of old CB. Legend claims he commissioned it himself, then billed the membership.
The man whose missionary zeal propelled the game was Charles Blair MacDonald. He brought from the old country, where he had gone as a student at St. Andrews University, he brought a love of the game and an interest in how to play it. But he also brought a belief in the traditions, and the game grew in his image.
When the 1900 U.S. Open came to the Chicago Golf Club, its most heralded competitor was Harry Vardon, the greatest player of his time. The Englishman displayed a new technique, the Vardon grip, which would become the standard, even to this day.
They used to say that he was so accurate that it was difficult for him to play the same course twice in a day because his tee shots would end up in the divots where he played his tee shot from in the morning. I have a feeling that's a bit apocryphal, but it's rather like saying, if you're talking about Tiger Woods or John Daly, if you stand behind them, you can smell the rubber burning, you know, as the ball goes away.
The two players in Britain who could give Harry a game were J.H. Taylor and James Braid. Collectively, the three of them won 16 of the 21 British Opens between 1894 and 1914. And in the 5 years when another man won, one of these three finished second. Quite deservedly, they became known as the Great Triumvirate. But Vardon, the only man to win 6 British Opens, was the greatest of the great. In 1900, he was at the peak of his powers and enjoying the fruit of his fame in the form of golf's first big endorsement contract from A.G. Spalding. The deal brought him to the States on a 9-month-long publicity tour to promote Spalding's hot new gutty ball called the Vardon Flyer. For a nation newly hooked on golf, Vardon's visit was mesmerizing. Wherever he went, hundreds of people came to see him, even in steely New York City. Vardon mania was so fervent that on the day of his visit, the stock exchange closed down. He capped his triumphant tour in Chicago with a victory in the U.S. Open. Vardon's amazing grace transformed the curious into converts. Golf in America began a big-time boom. By the end of 1900, there was at least one course in every state, 1,000 courses in all. And the U.S. boasted 250,000 players, more than the rest of the world combined. And not all of them were men. The ladies had wasted no time in stepping to the tee, occasionally even starting their own women-only clubs. The New York Times began one article with this breathless assertion: "A woman who wants to be good and beautiful, which is to say healthy, must play golf, the best game ever introduced in America." By those standards, the undisputed Miss America was the teenage sensation, Beatrix Hoyt.
It was at a time when, in America, most of the golfers were society people. It was still a very, very expensive game and sort of unusual to find a woman golfer. But in Great Britain, they had several very good players, and Beatrix Hoyt was really our first American star. She was a very lovely young society lady and a member of Shinnecock Hills Golf Club. She played in the U.S. Women's Amateur Championship at the age of 16 and won it, then won it again at the age of 17 and won it for her 3rd consecutive victory at the age of 18. And then for no logical reason, perhaps only that she felt she'd done everything she needed to do to prove that she was a wonderful player, she retired at the age of 18.
Meanwhile, golf got into college. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton fielded the first teams in an intercollegiate arena that would become the spawning ground for generations of American talent. And for one brief shining moment, the game grabbed worldwide notice as Charles Sands, the tennis-playing victim of C.B. McDonald, resurfaced in 1900 to win the scratch medal at the Paris Olympic Games. Yes, Golf was healthy, maybe too healthy. One Wayman McCreary shed 38 pounds after a ferocious schedule of rounds, but shortly thereafter he died. His doctor commented, "The golf fad for busy men who have become corpulent is a dangerous experiment, and the sad example of Mr. McCreary must be a warning for all." Undaunted, Americans took to the links with Yankee tenacity. They didn't want simply to play. They wanted to play with the graceful pivot, dazzling footwork, and overlapping grip that Harry Vardon had made famous. The result was an avalanche of magazines and books on golf technique, with some of the best work coming from a pair of top amateurs. H.J. Whigham, an Oxford-educated newspaper reporter, was an industrious fellow. He emigrated to Chicago, won back-to-back U.S. amateurs, married C.B. McDonald's daughter, and then wrote America's first great instruction book entitled simply, How to Play Golf. Walter Travis, an Australian-born American, took up the game at age 35. He won 3 of the first 4 amateur titles of the 20th century, then traveled to England and became the first overseas player to win the British Amateur, thanks in large part to a unique center-shafted putter called the Schenectady, which the Royal and Ancient Golf Club found so ominous that they banned it in Britain for half a century. Travis immortalized his methods in a book called Practical Golf and became the first editor of the American Golfer magazine. The game had become a $20 million business in America, with equipment sales leading the way. Ironically, the exception was the little pellet that started it all, the gutta-percha ball. By the time Harry had returned home, the Vardon Flyer had all but flown its last, as another new ball made its way to the tee. Coburn Haskell was a bicycle maker, outdoorsman, horse racer, and entrepreneur. He was also the shortest hitter in his foursome, and like every golfer before and after him, he daydreamed of longer drives. One day while visiting his friend Bertram Work, an engineer with the V.F. Goodrich Rubber Company, Haskell noticed a scrap basket full of elastic thread.
Haskell had the brainstorm that if he put a ball together with the construction much like a baseball, with a solid rubber core and a rubber thread wound under tension around it and a cover pattern, it would be much more durable and much more lively than the gutta-percha ball.
Well, it was easier said than done, wrapping several hundred feet of elastic band into a neat little sphere. Bertram Work described Haskell's early frustration. He would get the thing wound about halfway, and then it would leap out of his hands and go bounding about the room, unwinding naturally, with Haskell scrambling after it and cursing. But Haskell stuck with his idea, added a gutta-percha cover, and the result was America's first major golf invention, and perhaps the single most important contribution in the history of the game, the Haskell ball.
The new rubber ball flew 20 yards further than the gutta-percha ball, but its erratic properties earned it the nickname of Bounding Billy. In fact, some of the players in that era would use a gutta-percha ball to chip and putt around the greens. But when Walter Travis, who was renowned as a very short hitter, used the ball to win the 1901 U.S. Amateur, it took off in popularity and eventually was mass-produced by A.G. Spaulding on their automated ball-winding machine.
The British were more skittish, and Sandy Hurd was among the most vocal opponents. On the eve of the 1902 Open Championship, Hurd, a perennial contender, denounced the ball as unfit and expressed the hope that every other professional in the field would play it, as he most certainly would not. But a funny thing happened on his way to the tee. Hurd got a quick lesson on playing the Haskell from the appropriately named amateur ace, John Ball, and suddenly Sandy changed his mind. The result was the 1902 British Open went to Sandy Hurd by 1 stroke over Harry Vardon, who was still flogging the ill-fated Flyer. Incredibly, Hurd had used the same ball for all 72 holes, and just as incredibly, he had been the only player in the field to play a Haskell. And so a simple message was sent from both sides of the Atlantic. Goodbye, Gutty. The Haskellization of golf changed everything, beginning with the implements that struck the new ball. The softer, more springy Haskell required woods with a harder hit, and persimmon became the tree of choice, with inserts of various materials adding to the smack. Iron heads were enlarged and scored with grooves to help impart backspin, and clubs with extra loft were added to the bag, suddenly the key was not simply to make the ball go, but also to make it stop. The new and better ball commanded new and better courses. So in the early 1900s, architects took up their T-squares and went back to the drawing board. In Pittsburgh, Henry and William Fones unveiled Oakmont, the first of a wave of defiant American courses. Their philosophy was simple and stern. A shot poorly played should be a shot irrevocably lost. With Oakmont, the penal school of golf course architecture was born. Meanwhile, golf's first top-notch resort course took shape. Donald Ross emigrated from the links of Royal Dornoch in Scotland to the sandhills of North Carolina, where he built his masterpiece, Pinehurst No. 2. At the same time, a Philadelphia hotel owner named George Crump became obsessed with constructing the hardest course in the world. With the assistance of English architect H.S. Colt, he did just that in the Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey with the creation of Pine Valley. The sand and scrub that characterized the region defined every fairway and green on the course. It was a relentless examination in shot-making and strategy. When Pine Valley opened in 1913, other designers, including Donald Ross and C.B. McDonald, hailed it as the finest course in America. Three more Philadelphians would leave indelible marks on course design. The irascible Albert Tillinghast worked his magic mostly in the East with Wingfoot, and Baltusrol among his lasting monuments. George Thomas migrated to Southern California to design a pair of gems at Riviera and Los Angeles Country Club. And Hugh Wilson stayed home, crafting a masterpiece at Merion. From the beginning, these courses were more playable and enjoyable, not because of their design, but because of the advent of the power mower in 1913. Even at the old course in St. Andrews, the trusty four-legged agronomists were at last relieved of their duties. There was great excitement among American golfers in 1913. Harry Vardon returned to the U.S. for another barnstorming visit. This time, he brought along a formidable sidekick, Englishman Ted Ray, the defending British Open champion. Ray was a bulky, blustery, round-faced fellow built for power, and he used every ounce of it with a lumbering swing that heaved and swayed. Side by side, they looked like Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. But Vardon and Ray had not come to America to play exhibition matches. The New York Daily News claimed that their solemn mission was to win the U.S. Open. In fact, the USGA changed the date of that championship to mid-September, just so the two Brits could work it into their schedule. When Vardon and Ray arrived at the Country Club in Brookline, Massachusetts, they were met by the largest field the Open had ever attracted. Of course, most of them were long shots, and one of the longest was a young local fellow named Francis Ouimet.
Just imagine a 20-year-old sporting goods salesman growing up across the street from the Country Club, having caddied there since age 11. A pretty good player locally, he decides to enter the U.S. Open, not expecting to win the championship or even do especially well, but he wanted to get a nice up-close and personal look at Harry Vardon.
Well, he got that and much more. With 10-year-old caddy Eddie Lowry at his side, Ouimet roared home, playing the final 9 holes in 36 strokes for an astonishing first-place tie with Vardon and Ray, a tie that forced an 18-hole playoff the next day. In a display of extraordinary coolness under pressure, the young David slew both Goliaths, beating Vardon by 5 strokes and Ray by 6. The game of golf had never seen anything like it.
You know, I'll never forget, I was caddying at Opwamas, and this banker says to me, he says, you know, a caddy became Open champion today? I says, a caddy? Yeah, the caddy by the name of Francis Ouimet defeated Vardon and Ray at Brookline. I was so inspired. I said, oh boy, I've got to find out about that.
You can liken it to the first person to climb Everest or you know, row across the Atlantic in a little dinghy boat on your own. You're the first one to do it. Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile. Ouimet did something that people didn't think was possible.
The columnist Henry Leach wrote, when we know the secrets of life after death, and when we may go for weekend golfing trips to Jupiter and Mars. Perhaps then I will believe that your little Francis Ouimet has won today. This was the greatest day in all golf history. There will never be another like it. There cannot be.
Over 80 years later, that statement still rings true. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find in American sport a greater upset than Ouimet winning the 1913 Open over Varden and Ray. Francis Ouimet became the first bona fide American golf hero.
While being paraded around Brookline on the shoulders of the delirious fans, he leaned over and whispered to a small woman, "Thank you, Mother. I'll be home soon." In the aftermath of Ouimet's victory, golf participation in the United States grew from 350,000 to 2 million. American golfers became the best players in the world. But there was still plenty of class consciousness out there, particularly with regard to professional golfers. The early club pros, most of them transplanted Scots, were seen as little more than golf-talented servants, meant to repair clubs, give lessons, and generally stay out of the way. But as more and more homegrown players became professionals, the spirit of American egalitarianism began to take hold. And so in January of 1916, at the Taplow Club in New York City, the Professional Golfers Association of America was formed. Its founding purposes were to set standards for golf professionals and to give them a voice. The guiding light was Rodman Wanamaker, heir to one of the country's leading department store fortunes. He bankrolled the group and donated a trophy for the first PGA championship held at the Siwanoy Golf Club just north of New York City. It was an unremarkable event. Only 31 men entered, and the Wanamaker Trophy went to England's Jim Barnes.
Well, that first PGA championship jump-started professional golf. Back in those days, all the players had club jobs. They would give lessons, they'd re-grip clubs. The tour, if you wanted to call it a tour, was basically just a barnstorming operation. Some events in the wintertime, a few events in the summer, but nobody would have dreamt at that time that you could really make a living out of just playing tournament golf.
No one, that is, except Walter Hagen. Hagen was hardly a stylist. A former semi-pro baseball player, he gripped the club as if it were a Louisville Slugger and lunged through impact with power to all fields. The first player to master the art of scoring, he was fearless from trouble. No one was better at turning 3 shots into 2.
My father knew him very well. Father said the great thing about Hagen was he never hit 2 bad shots in a row, which is an interesting concept. You know, if he hit 1 bad shot, well, the next one, there was maximum concentration. And he always allowed himself 5 or 6 bad shots around.
Much of Hagen's aptitude came from his attitude, a curious blend of self-confidence and nonchalance. His advice became part of every good lesson on the mental side of golf. Don't hurry, don't worry, and don't forget to smell the flowers along the way.
In Walter Hagen, American golf found a real beaut. Hagen was a larger-than-life personality. I mean, I think there's a reason that he was called Sir Walter. And he certainly had a sense of bravado about him, but he could back up his statements. There were many golf tournaments where he'd show up on the scene, and he'd say, "Well, I'm here. Who's going to finish second this week?"
To Hagen, tournaments were cocktail parties, and cocktail parties were what he did best.
He never used to say no to a drink, but he used to just sort of wait until you're the donor of the drink. He'd wait and he'd sort of pour it into the aspidestra or put it behind the curtains, or, you know, he always appeared to be a cigarette in the hand, which sometimes wasn't puffed on, but it was there, and the drink in the hand was there.
He showed up allegedly at the for his playoff with Mike Brady in the 1919 U.S. Open at Brayburn. Coming out of a limousine wearing a dinner jacket, as if he had been out all night.
His flamboyant game and equally flamboyant personality made him box office magic, which helped to finance his taste for the finer things. Golf writer Charles Price said, "Walter made as much money as Babe Ruth, but spent more money than the entire Yankee outfield." On the cover of his autobiography was his mantra: "I never wanted to be a millionaire, I just wanted to live like one." The Roaring Twenties couldn't have asked for a more perfect champion.
As great a champion as Hogan was, he'll probably best be remembered for being the guy to break down the barriers as far as American golf professionals. Because until Walter Hogan, golf professionals were treated as truly second-class citizens. They took their meals in the kitchen. Hogan led them out the kitchen door and right through the front door.
Sir Walter set the early standard for performance in major championships. In 1922, he became the first American to win the British Open. But it was in the PGA Championship that the Hague truly strutted his stuff, with 5 victories, including an unprecedented 4 in a row. In 1927, Samuel Ryder, an English seed merchant, established a competition matching the best pros from America against their counterparts from Great Britain and Ireland. Who better to captain the American squad than Walter Hogan? The leader of the first 6 teams, the Hague won 80% of his matches. Those early Ryder Cups were just as closely contested as the big-time battles today, but there was not nearly the same degree of public interest. Why? Well, the allure of any competition in those days was limited if it lacked the presence of a fellow named Bobby Jones. Some say that it's only a game, and an odd one at that, involving a stick, a ball, and a hole in the ground. Where it began, no one knows. Its origin is lost in the mists of time. But its soul is timeless.
There's not a game you can name that is as varied, as complex, as exalted one moment and painful the next as golf. It's a game where you go from immense highs to immense lows, and you're trying to beat a foe who doesn't exist.
For this is a game shared by fathers and sons, on fields touched with beauty by the hand of God, and others nurtured with love by mankind.
Wherever you go, the game is like it's like a church. I mean, it's a philosophy of life. It's a religion almost. I mean, it's a gospel of golf, and it's everywhere and nowhere. The game is within us.
Its transfixing appeal has captured all. The feats of a steelworker's son once inspired the hopes of a pharmacist's son. And two youngsters, born decades apart, ignited the spirit of their generations. Where it began, no one knows. What it has become, no one imagined. Robert Tyre Jones Jr. was a certified prodigy. At age 12, he had been the club champion at the East Lake Country Club in Atlanta. A year later, he shot a course record 68 there. As a 14-year-old, he burst upon the national scene in the 1916 U.S. Amateur at Marion.
As a young man, Jones had a terrible temper. He would throw clubs frequently, and he would cuss like a sailor.
He, in fact, was sent home from a U.S. amateur by the USGA president, who said, and don't come back until you can behave.
By strength of character, Jones subdued a naturally fiery temper so that outwardly he played the game as a man of ice, though the flames continued to leap up within him. And of course, after he conquered his temper, Bob then made the most triumphant journey ever made in sports.
Within 8 years, from 1923 to 1930, Jones won 4 U.S. Opens, 3 British Opens, 5 U.S. Amateurs, and 1 British Amateur, a total of 13 national championships, 62% of those he entered.
Most people think that Bob Jones did nothing but play golf his whole life, but actually, Jones was a weekend golfer. He never played more golf than the average club member. He had his priorities right. First was God and family, then was his profession, the law, and lastly was golf, but never a life unto itself.
He was a brilliant person. He was a Renaissance person. He loved opera. Puccini was his favorite. He had broad interests.
Jones was one of the most educated golfers of the day. He graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech in 1922. Then he went to Harvard and got a degree in English literature. Then he went to Emory Law School and decided to take the bar exam. And after the first year, he passed it to his amazement and was sworn into the bar and didn't even have to graduate from law school.
Bobby Jones was a supremely natural player. His tee shots averaged 250 yards with a hickory-shafted driver. But Jones's true strength was his angelic touch with Calamity Jane, the simple blade putter he used throughout his career. And it was never more effective than in 1930, when Bobby Jones accomplished the unthinkable. It was a journey that stretched across 4 months and several thousand miles, beginning in St. Andrews with the title Jones most wanted to win, the British Amateur. Two weeks later at Hoylake, he broke the competitive course record for 72 holes and won his 3rd British Open. No American had ever won both of these titles, back-to-back or otherwise, and on his return to the States, New Yorkers gave their conquering hero a ticker-tape parade. Then he was off to Minnesota and the U.S. Open at Interlochen Country Club. In a display of the competitive resilience that was his trademark, Jones finished with 3 birdies on his last 6 holes, including a dramatic 40-footer to cap the victory. With 3/4 of golf's majors won, only the U.S. Amateur remained. Bobby returned to Marion, the site of his national championship debut. He won the qualifying medal for lowest score and was never down to an opponent. In the 36-hole final, a unit of 50 Marines in full-dress blues was assigned to escort Jones as he played his way through a throng of 18,000 well-wishers. With a convincing 8-7 victory, Bobby completed his triumphant journey. The New York Sun christened it the Impregnable Quadrilateral. Ever since, it's been known as golf's Grand Slam, and it remains the most extraordinary achievement in the history of the game. Jones's career was as brief as it was brilliant. When he completed the Grand Slam, he was only 28 years old. He then retired.
I really think Herbert Warren Wind summed it up best when he wrote, "Golf without Jones was like France without Paris, leaderless, lightless, and lonely.
In retirement, Jones had plenty to keep him occupied. He published 3 books, designed a matched set of golf clubs for Spalding, and collaborated with Warner Brothers Studios on a series of film shorts. But the lion's share of Jones's energy went into the pursuit of his dream course. With a group of investors, he purchased 365 acres of land in Augusta, Georgia. The site of the course was a Civil War indigo plantation that had been converted into a horticultural nursery by a Belgian nobleman and called Fruitlands. The rolling countryside was planted with a dazzling assortment of trees, shrubs, and flowers. Alistair Mackenzie, the famed Scottish architect, drew the maps, while Jones played thousands of experimental shots to the planned greens.
What Jones said he wanted was as close as possible to, on an inland hilly site, the same values, shot values, as the old course at St. Andrews, which he loved. So what you have at Augusta is fairly wide, spacious fairways, but very large greens, which are very undulating and accessible and open, but you have to hit the ball to the right place or bounce the ball in. That's the St. Andrews part of Augusta.
When the design was finished, Mackenzie called it his finest achievement. It looked easy, but it didn't play that way.
It really is the essence of risk versus reward in golf architecture. And that's exactly what Bobby Jones wanted. He later said, there isn't a hole out there that you can't make birdie if you think, and there isn't a hole out there that you can't make bogey if you stop thinking.
Almost immediately, the USGA expressed interest in holding a U.S. Open there. The members were struck by the idea, but then they thought, if we're going to hold a tournament, let's hold our own. And so in 1934, the Masters was born, with Jones as host and his Augusta co-founder Clifford Roberts as the tournament chairman. Actually, in those days, it was called the Augusta National Invitation, and that's what it was, an invitation from Jones to get together for some good golf and good times. In the short time that he was at golf's center stage, Jones had enraptured golf fans on 2 continents, but nowhere more than in the city of St. Andrews, where so much of his career had unfolded. From his first embarrassing appearance in the 1921 British Open, when he tore up his scorecard and stomped off the course, to the Open he dominated in 1927, to his crowning achievement in the Amateur of 1930. By the time of Jones's final visit to St. Andrews, his body was ravaged by a crippling disease of the spine. He had come to receive the city's greatest honor.
I was a 9-year-old boy when my father took me to the Freedom of the City ceremony for Bobby Jones, 1958. As young as I was, I'll always remember what a moving experience it was. Bobby Jones, who threw down his notes and just talked really from the heart. The one thing I remember particularly was his phrase, if I could take everything from my life but my experiences in St. Andrews, I'd still have had a rich, full life. The whole of the audience, which comprised of just St. Andrews people, maybe 2,000 people, stood up and spontaneously sang, "Will You No Come Back Again?"
Herbert Warren Wynn summarized the great amateur's life. As a young man, he wrote, he was able to stand up to just about the best that life could offer, which isn't easy. And later he stood up with equal grace to just about the worst. Jones's spirit lives on with the Masters, an event that has grown by leaps and bounds since its modest start. And the biggest leap came just 1 year after its inception, with the shot heard round the world. Gene Sarazen was 3 strokes off the lead when he came to Augusta National's 15th hole. Roughly 230 yards from the green, he elected to go for it with a 4-wood. It took 1 big bounce and rolled straight into the cup for a 2, a double eagle. Sarazen had made up all 3 strokes with 1 glorious shot. He trounced Craig Wood the next day in a 36-hole playoff. With his dramatic victory, Sarazen put the capper on a classic American success story. At age 15, he saw his name in a newspaper for having made a hole-in-one and decided Eugenio Sarazen looked more like the name of a violin maker than a golfer, so he shortened it to Gene Sarazen.
You know, he came from immigrant parents. He came out of the caddy pen, and at 20 years of age, he wins the U.S. Open and the PGA Championship. Now, this is really the American dream.
In 1923, Gene made it 2 PGAs in a row. But the success may have been too much too soon, and he fell into a decade of relative decline. As he approached his 30th birthday, Sarazen analyzed his problems and decided his high scores had come largely from his poor play in the bunkers. And so he did something about it. Sarazen got the idea while flying with billionaire Howard Hughes. On takeoff, when the plane's elevators went down, the plane rose up. If he could lower the sole of his niblick, maybe that would help lift the ball from the sand. So he soldered a thick flange on the back of the club and angled it. When the flange hit the sand first, it allowed the front of the club to bounce upward. Now he could hit behind the ball and splash it out.
What are there, 23 million golfers today? Whatever. Everybody's got a sand wedge, and he started it all. He took it to England, he hid it, he put it upside down in the bag so they wouldn't declare it illegal before he got to play with it.
The feisty confidence of his early days was restored. Sarazen won the 1932 British Open by 5 strokes and broke the 72-hole record. 2 weeks later, he added the U.S. Open in a virtuoso performance that saw him cover the final 28 holes in 100 strokes, an average of 3.6 per hole. The man once known as Eugenio Sarazen became the first player to win all 4 major championships. In 1931, another major equipment development was occurring. The USGA and R&A had approved the production of golf clubs with shafts made of tubular steel.
The hickory shafts were a problem because hickory was affected by the weather conditions. As the humidity increased, the hickory would change its flexural properties. One day you had a little stiffer shaft than you had on another day.
That was a big change because the hickory shaft was, every time you got caught in the rain, you had to go in the pro shop and shellac the shaft and just try to straighten out. It warped.
Up to now, golfers had built up their arsenals rather haphazardly, buying a brassy here and a mashie there. The result was often a bag full of weapons that were eternally at odds with one another. Steel shafts put an immediate end to that with the advent of the matched set. For the first time in history, technology provided consistency. There was even a mysterious new measurement called swing weight that could calibrate shafts to a golfer's liking. But not every development was technical. Golf clubs now began to be designated with numerals instead of names. The brassy became a 2-wood, the niblick a 9-iron. With no limit on the number of clubs in a set, golfers began arriving at the first tee with 24 clubs and more. Lawson Little, the winner of back-to-back titles in both the U.S. and British amateurs in 1934 and 35, is reputed to have secured his victories with the help of a 31-club set.
That's about the period of time when the USGA and the R&A decided on 14 clubs rather than the 24 or more that we had.
As golfers began swinging their steel shafts with a slashing vigor that was impossible in the hickory era, everyone got a jolt of extra distance. Once again, technology was shaping the way the game was played. So in 1942, the USGA imposed a limit on the velocity a golf ball may have at impact when measured on the association's testing machine. Still, as golf equipment became more consistent, more precise, and more powerful, so did golf's best players. And in the late 1930s, America produced its own great triumvirate. Ben Hogan, Sam Snead, and Byron Nelson were all born in 1912. But it was Nelson, a lanky, baby-faced Texan, who first gained major attention when he won the 1937 Masters. 2 years later, he won the U.S. Open. Not since Harry Vardon had anyone hit the ball with such unremitting accuracy. His swing was the first to adapt successfully to the new and different demands of the steel-shafted club. While the rest of the world continued to imitate Bobby Jones, Nelson put some action in his legs. When in form, Byron Nelson simply did not miss-hit a shot. In 1945, he was close to unbeatable. There were 35 tournaments that year. Nelson won 18 of them. Even more incredibly, he won 11 of those events in one glorious unbroken string. The next longest streak, before or since, is 5. His season scoring average, 68.33, a record. In 30 events, he never finished worse than 9th.
Now, it's very easy to dismiss him and say, well, nobody was there. Who did he beat? The war was on. He did it all, just a joyous game of golf, knocking a ball around. But you take all that out of it and actually look at the scores he did. Now, if you go and play virtually on your own, just with someone to keep the score for you, you can build up your own demons because you can become afraid because you're doing so well. Oh, my God, if I get 2 pars, I'll do a 64. That'll break the course. And you become, these inner demons take over, and you can mess up. He never did.
Nelson's total prize money for that year of years was $63,000. By today's standards, that would be roughly $10 million. Byron retired young, just as Samuel Jackson Snead was getting warmed up. After one West Coast victory, the young West Virginia hayseed wondered how the New York Times got his picture, since he'd never been to New York. Well, he may have been naive, but could he ever hit the ball?
He's got the greatest swing of all time. People talk about, you know, Hogan's swing. Well, Hogan manufactured that swing. Sam's natural. That's just the most beautiful thing you've ever seen.
I never saw him take a swing that it looked like there's any labor whatsoever to turn or to move. He was just free and easy. When we first came out on the tour, people would ask Sam how he learned to play, and he says, I don't know, I just draws it back and hits it.
Although completely self-taught, Snead was blessed with a supremely supple body and an innately perfect rhythm.
He's always been a physical guy. He always trained. He did push-ups and sit-ups and all that stuff. He always asked you, hit me in the stomach, look how hard my stomach is.
He said to me, how many push-ups can you do? And I said, I don't know, I was 15 years of age, and I didn't want to admit I didn't do push-ups, but you could always struggle through 10 of them, and I did, but at my own peril. Because of course, then he got down on his fingertips, just bounced to, just jump up in the air off his fingertips.
Snead's total of 84 victories outnumbered any man in history. Among these, 3 Masters, 3 PGAs, and a British Open in his only appearance across the pond. But there was one glorious omission: the U.S. Open. Sam Snead was the Methuselah of the fairways. He's the oldest player to win on the PGA Tour, having recorded at least 1 victory every year until 1962, a quarter century after he began. At age 62, he tied for 3rd in the PGA. When he won on the Senior Tour in 1980, he became the first golfer to record victories in 6 different decades. He will likely be the last, for Sam Snead was one of a kind. While Snead played golf naturally, Ben Hogan dug it out of the dirt. Just 5 feet 8 inches tall and 135 pounds, Hogan was the runt of the caddy pen at the same club where Byron Nelson caddied.
A bunch of those caddies would line up and hit balls, and the one hit the shortest one had to go get them, bring them back. And so Ben found out that you had hard ground, that if he'd turn his left hand over and roll the ball and hook it, make it roll, he wouldn't have to go get them all the time because he was small.
Byron's early success drove Hogan. He brought to the game the mind of a championship chess player, believing that 80% of winning is management. He managed himself and the golf course with ruthless rigor. His nickname said it all, the Hawk. He came about as close as anyone to mastering golf from tee to green, thanks to a monkish devotion to hard work.
Hogan's gotten credit for inventing practice, and he took it to an art form. There's no question about that. And I'd go out and watch him practice. He'd be hitting choke down 3-irons about 152 yards, and the caddy, the shag boy, wasn't moving a step in one direction or the other. And every now and then he'd turn around and say, come on, let's go play. He would just, with incredible ease, shoot 66, 67, 68 at Colonial on the back tees. And we'd come in and have a drink after the round, and I'd say, man, that's about as good a round of golf as I've ever seen in my life. And he would say, that wasn't a good round of golf. Excuse me? He said, no, I didn't hit more than 2 shots that came out the way I wanted them to.
By 1948, he had won 30 times, that year highlighted by his first U.S. Open triumph. 8 months later, Ben Hogan was lucky to be alive. While he and his wife Valerie were returning from the 1949 West Coast swing, his car collided grill to grill with a Greyhound bus. His doctor said he might never walk again. 1 year later, walking on legs wrapped in elastic bandages, he returned to golf at the LA Open and finished second. He convinced any remaining doubters that June in the U.S. Open at Merion. Although in pain from the stress of walking a 36-hole final day, Hogan persevered. He tied Lloyd Mangrum and George Fazio in regulation play and then beat them in a playoff. That victory remains one of the most courageous performances in sports. But Hogan's vintage year was 1953. At Augusta, he lowered the tournament record by 5. At Oakmont, he led from wire to wire, taking the U.S. Open for the 4th time in his last 5 starts. Then he sailed across the Atlantic to play the British Open for the first and only time. Hogan assaulted the field in the cold and wind of Carnoustie. With a final round course record 68, he won by 4 strokes.
It was as good a golf as anybody could play. I mean, he drowned everybody. He just had this something about the way the ball sounded when it came off the club face. It didn't sound like anybody else's. It just had more authority.
He returns to the States a hero.
New York is really golf happy today. It's the biggest welcome the city has given any golfer since the heyday of Bobby Jones 23 years ago. Ben Hogan, the world's greatest golfer.
The era of Hogan, Nelson, and Snead transformed big-time golf into a game that was strictly for professionals, but only on the men's side. She was perhaps the most talented player of all time. Her name was Mildred, but everyone knew her as Babe.
Babe Zaharias was undoubtedly a larger-than-life personality. She did everything in a big way.
She went into vaudeville, she shot pool, anything a guy could do, she could do better. And she was just an amazing person. I mean, she was women's lib before women's lib got a name.
At the 1932 Olympic Games, she won 2 gold medals. No woman and few men could run, jump, throw, and hit like the Babe. Her first years were spent touring the country in exhibitions with the top pros, and later with her husband, pro wrestler George Zaharias. A born performer, the Babe lived for the limelight.
She was colorful in a child's eyes. I mean, I was quite young, and I just thought she was extraordinary. As far as she could hit it, I'd never seen a woman be able to hit it that far.
She really got her weight into it, and she could hit it like a man. She was very, very strong, but she had the attitude of confidence. I mean, she had a bit of the Hagen quality about her.
When the Babe turned pro, she acquired the services of Fred Corcoran, a well-known agent who had handled baseball slugger Ted Williams. She was making money, but what she really wanted was competition and an audience. And so in 1950, the Ladies Professional Golf Association was formed.
The fans bought the tickets to see Babe. They never knew what she was going to do. She was a heroic figure, not just in golf, but on the American scene. And she enjoyed the fans. Without her, it probably would have taken another 10 years to get the LPGA started.
It was Babe who made it all happen. The other women were all in charge. They were the president. They were the ones that were organizing it. But it was Babe who would basically pick up the phone and call a businessman and say, hey, I want to have a tournament. Can you foot this? I'll come. I promise you I'll be there, and I'm going to bring a lot of women. And let's just get it going. And she'd be sitting there with her feet kicked up on a bed in a hotel room, and the guy would say, well, sure, Babe, come on.
The Babe dominated those early years, winning the money title 4 times in a row and racking up 31 tournament victories. And she likely would have won dozens more had her career not been curtailed by cancer. She was diagnosed at age 42, and the doctor's prognosis was not good. He didn't know the babe. The next year, she won 5 tournaments, including the U.S. Women's Open.
Here she is, winning by a mile, one of the most inspiring comebacks in all sports history.
I was laying there in room 201 at the Hotel Dieu Hospital, and these reports were going out about that I never play championship or tournament golf again. And I laid in the bed and I says, please God, let me play again. And he answered my prayer. And I want to thank God for letting me win again. It's really wonderful.
Babe was very ill that last Christmas, and she came to spend that Christmas with Bertha Bowen and her husband R.L. in Fort Worth. I believe it was on Christmas Eve, and Babe asked Bertha to take her over to Colonial Country Club, and Babe had on her pajamas and her bathrobe. She wasn't really dressing at all. She was so sick at that point. And Bertha drove her on this little dirt road up next to the second green, and she helped Babe get out of the car and helped her walk over to the side of the green. And Babe knelt down and rubbed the green with her hand. And she said, I just wanted to see a golf course one more time.
But Babe was not the only talent on that fledgling ladies' tour. Even on her best days, she could be beaten by a freckle-faced tomboy named Patty Berg. Patty had come from the unlikely golf hotbed of Minnesota, where speed skating and sandlot football were part of her early training. She had a dazzling amateur career, continued winning as a pro, and became the game's most devoted ambassador. No player has done more exhibitions than Patty.
As I would sign anybody to a contract, any girl to play on the LPGA Tour, they had to go to what we called the Patty Berg School. And the purpose of that was to train them how to give a clinic and an exhibition. They called her the drill sergeant because, as you know, Patty was in the Marine Corps during the war. She had them up at 6 o'clock in the morning, worked them over all day long. 6 o'clock at night, they were still grinding away. The girls would call me at home and say, we're quitting, we can't take it anymore, she's killing us. But they all survived and they all stayed, and I think they thank Patty for it now.
Patty and Babe dominated women's pro golf for the next decade, with Patty amassing a career total of 44 wins.
Patty Berg is probably one of the 5 greatest women players in the history of the game. Her skills are almost unsurpassed. She was sort of overshadowed as a player by Babe Zaharias, only because Babe was a little bit more flamboyant. But Patty took the high road. She was never jealous of other players. She chose to be a good sport about it, and she's probably the best friend that the game of golf has ever had.
And then there was Mickey Wright, who was the one woman most responsible for the success of the LPGA. She won 65 tournaments, nearly a third of those she entered, including 4 U.S. Women's Opens.
I've never seen anyone strike the ball better than Mickey. I mean, she has the best swing I've ever seen in golf, and I'm not alone in saying that. You know, Ben Hogan said that about Mickey Wright.
I think professional golf was a little bit tough for Mickey in a way, because once she became the dominant player on the tour, there were sponsors who would call her at home and threaten to cancel a tournament if she did not enter the tournament. In fact, they used to say that the only tournament Mickey could afford to skip was the U.S. Women's Open.
The rise of Mickey Wright mirrored the steady growth of the LPGA, which in turn reflected the good times in America. After 2 decades of depression and war, the country had emerged into a period of expansion and prosperity. For more Americans than ever before, it was time to play golf. New courses were popping up everywhere, and they weren't quite like the old ones. Earth-moving equipment had replaced horse-drawn scrapers, allowing designers to sculpt their visions from the dirt. Riding mowers had made courses easier and less expensive to maintain, while also producing mammoth greens and tees. And expanded commercial air travel brought vacation areas within easy reach. Dozens of resort courses opened across America's southern tier. The architects of the 20s and 30s had all passed away, but into the breach stepped one man.
Robert Trent Jones really made golf architecture a profession. Until he came along, even gentlemen like C.B. McDonald did it part-time, and most came from other avenues. Mackenzie was a doctor, Rayner was an engineer, Perry Maxwell was a banker. Trent Jones decided at a very early age that he wanted to be a golf architect, went to college, studied for that specific purpose, and made it his life's devotion to design golf courses.
By 1945, he had solidified his reputation by collaborating with the great Bobby Jones on the design of Atlanta's Peachtree Golf Club.
My father recognized that as the game was now reborn after the Depression and war, that the traditional, very private clubs would have to give way to this expanding influx of players. So he almost democratized the game in the sense that first it was more open and with public courses, but he also made the courses themselves more accessible. He put the tees back, but he also put them forward for the beginning players and for the young children and older people.
An advertising agency started advertising Robert Trent Jones architecture as give your course a signature. And that's really the origin of the terms signature course and signature hole. And no other architect had as identifiable a signature in his features as Robert Trent Jones.
Feather-edged bunkering, multi-tiered greens, and a variety of teeing areas became Trent Jones trademarks. And today, more than 500 courses around the world bear his signature. The era's other unheralded master builder was George S. May, a flashy Chicago businessman who transformed tournaments into show business. He was the P.T. Barnum of golf, the first to put up grandstands so more people could follow the action. He was the first to put up scoreboards. And for a time, he actually pinned numbers on the backs of the players so they could be more readily identified by the gallery. But most of all, May was the first to put golf on TV. For the final round of his 1953 World Championship of Golf, May positioned a single camera atop the grandstand at the 18th green of the Tam O'Shanter Country Club in Illinois. Coming to that final hole, Lou Worsham needed a birdie 3 to reach a playoff for the $25,000 first prize, then the biggest payoff in golf. Well, talk about flamboyant. Worsham holed his wedge for an eagle 2, an outright victory in the championship.
I'm watching on a couch, and I almost fell off the couch. I got hysterical. I said, you know, that's impossible, because I'd been playing golf for about 2 years at that point in time. And, of course, they didn't have videotape in those days, so it couldn't be played back. But I think the true marriage between golf and television took place when the cameras discovered Arnold Palmer.
He came along at a time when in the cultural zeitgeist of America, the setting was right. Golf was a sleepy country club game, and then along comes this muscular, tilting Pennsylvanian with a corkscrew swing and a handsome grimace, and suddenly he was an irresistible figure.
Arnold Daniel Palmer, the classic American sports icon, was a man of the people.
Arnold was another Walter Hagen. He smoked cigarettes, he'd have a whiskey, he smashed the ball all over the place, he holed long putts, he was daring do.
He sweated, he chain smoked, his shirt tail came out, he hit the ball through tree trunks.
He played golf like it was almost a barroom brawl.
Somehow, Arnold remains the boy next door. He's everybody's hero.
He grew up in western Pennsylvania, the son of a steelworker turned golf professional and green superintendent.
There's a tough and resilient side to Arnold, the fighter that comes from his father. Very disciplined, tremendous will to win, driven almost, hard as nails, hands like a blacksmith. And then from his mother's side, he had this great people side. His mother was a tremendous people person.
As a 19-year-old, Arnold burst on the golfing scene when he won the U.S. Amateur. 6 years later at the Masters, Palmer came into America's living rooms one birdie away from victory. I remember that one well.
Here it comes with a 5 or 6 iron. The ball on the green and within approximately 3 feet of the pin. A magnificent shot by Arnold Palmer.
I'll never forget that scene. Arnold coming over the brow of the hill with a cigarette, and that now famous stance of his where he hitched up his trousers and snorted a little bit and flipped the cigarette away in some sense of defiance, as if to say, I can conquer anything and everything in life. And here's this blue-collar fellow who all of a sudden has captured a game that up until then had a very elitist look to it.
Palmer was a perfect figure for television because of the athleticism and the good looks and the way he played the game. He created the excitement that TV symbolized. You know, it was immediate, it was fresh, it could take people right to the scene in ways that media had never done.
The legend continued to grow later that summer, both in America with his come-from-behind victory at Cherry Hills in the U.S. Open, and abroad, where he single-handedly changed the course of another championship.
He was the one who really popularized the British Open again. Once he came to Scotland, and he played in the Open Championship in the Centenary Open at St Andrews, which he finished second in, and that set the Open alight again. And so it's really thanks to Arnold that the Open is what it is today.
The British took to Arnold like no golfer since Bobby Jones, and it was contagious as around the world the game clung to his coattails. Palmer was the first player to hire an agent, the first to capitalize on his popularity off the course, and the first to earn $100,000 in one season. No question, the modern professional was forged in Palmer's image. Golf fans everywhere were drawn to his charisma. They called themselves Arnie's Army.
He loved performing in front of people. He loved to make people laugh and clap and smile. And he knew that pulling off a great shot would electrify people.
I've never known a person in my whole life who enjoyed being who he was as much as Arnold enjoys being Arnold Palmer. I mean, he truly loves it. I used to accuse him of carrying a pair of high-powered binoculars around with him so he could see if there was somebody else who might need an autograph, you know?
In a sense, Arnold Palmer sold golf to the American public, and his #1 customer was another national hero who picked up the game and brought it to the White House lawn.
Well, Eisenhower was the first serious golf nut president we ever had. So again, it was one of those conjunction of stars. Arnold was, to Eisenhower, like a symbol of, you know, perfect emerging American youth. And, you know, Arnold was like a son to Eisenhower.
Together, they spread the gospel to millions of leisure-minded Americans. Between 1960 and 1970, golf in the United States boomed as never before. As the number of players doubled from 5 million to 10, the number of courses exploded from 6,300 to 10,000. In effect, a new golf course opened in America every day of the year for 10 straight years. But no aspect grew more dramatically than the professional tour. Except for a couple of California Pro-Ams and the majors, the tour had been a succession of modest community-run events. All that changed on Arnie's watch, as commercial sponsors began to pay serious money for television rights. Pro golf became big business.
Today we're covering the 5 finishing holes, Bing, and I would like to say this is the first year in color, and I appreciate the fact that you have on such a beautiful green hat.
How do you like that little red cap?
To walk into the truck in those early years and look at black and white pictures was really depressing. But boy, when we got color cameras, and I just sat in total bewilderment and amazement. And I thought, oh, this is it. This is it.
Television's impact spawned a dramatic increase in purses for professional golfers. The world could now watch closely, and what they were about to see would amaze a generation. As a youngster, it wasn't difficult to predict success for Jack Nicklaus. By age 13, he had broken 70, and by age 16, he had his first taste of victory against professionals.
He just terrified me, the way that he could hit the ball so far and was such a good player. I thought, what am I doing? I'm wasting my time playing this game. You can't compete with people like that.
By the time he turned pro, no player had been more eagerly anticipated or more rudely greeted.
I think Jack's entry into the professional scene was so different from Arnold. Arnold was so warm and expressive and outgoing, and Jack was very different. He was very internal, and he didn't show much emotion, and he wasn't demonstrative, and I think the public made the comparison and said, hey, he's the black hat. You know, people called him Blubber Boy and Whale Man and Nicklaus because of the direct comparison with Arnold.
His first pro victory didn't enhance that image. In the 1962 U.S. Open, played at Oakmont in Arnie's backyard, Jack unseated the king in a dramatic playoff and sent tremors throughout the golfing world.
A lot of Palmer fans are going, gee, if Jack hadn't come around, Arnold would still be the king. But, you know, I really believe somebody else would have come around. Not to say that they would have been better than Arnold necessarily, but only to say that the game is constantly building on itself.
After Arnie, Jack enjoyed rivalries with several world-class players. Billy Casper won a pair of U.S. Opens by 1966 and 53 times overall. The Merry Mex, Lee Trevino, challenged Jack often, winning 6 major championships of his own. But Kansas City's Tom Watson made the boldest mark of all. Twice he defeated the Golden Bear in memorable battles for the British Open and the U.S. Open. I'll never forget Pebble Beach.
Looks good. Do you believe what can you say?
Jack has and has always had an incredible ability to focus. He saw himself right after he won, I think it was a 62 Open, smoking on the highlights film. Didn't like it, so he never again smoked when he was playing golf. But I once said to him, how can you possibly smoke 20 cigarettes a day in normal life, and when you're playing golf, you don't seem to need it? He said, Kenny, I never think about it. Now there is an example of focus.
His career is unparalleled. He set the competitive standard for excellence. To put it in proper perspective, ask which 2 players of the modern era, when taken together, can claim 18 major championships and 19 runner-up finishes. The answer is none.
Most people, when they get under pressure, they get uptight and they get cool and they get worried and tense and anxious and jittery. Nicklaus under pressure is having more fun than in any other situation. That's what he'd been preparing for, that's what he was geared to, and he had a ball.
The stoutest of hearts and the coolest of heads and an enormous desire. So you put the whole package together and it was a genius.
But if ever there was one moment that defined Nicklaus's ability to focus, it was the 1986 Masters. By then, at age 46, the Golden Bear had become the Olden Bear. He had not won a tournament in 2 years, not won a major in 6.
The golf press corps is very cynical. I mean, somebody hits a bad shot and it's like, oh, he's done, he's toast, that's it. And here's these group of crusty guys whistling God Bless America, sitting in the old Quonset hut at the Masters, just screaming and yelling and clapping and yes, yes, it's Jack, it's Jack.
For 2 glorious hours, the vintage Nicklaus returned. Jack roared past his young rivals for a record 6th green jacket.
You're sitting there looking at history, and I remember some of the great writers standing up at the end of the day after we'd all sent our stories and saying, man, this was just too big to write.
Nicklaus brought that Teutonic air, Germanic air to the game of golf. And I always felt, although Jack said, oh, I've lost a few tournaments, but Jack lost fewer tournaments than anyone else I've ever met in my life. If he had an opportunity to win, if he had a sniff of the trophy or the check, he was there.
In the last quarter of the 20th century, the game of golf underwent evolutionary changes as never before. The average Joe got a boost when Spalding unveiled the two-piece ball under the name Top Flight. Its solid core was covered with a synthetic substance called Sarazen. Instantly, it became the darling of mid to high handicappers who saved some money, added some distance, and after mishit shots, saw far fewer balls smiling back at them. An aerospace engineer named Karsten Solheim began making clubs in his garage through a new process called investment casting, in which molten metal was poured into a mold. The design moved mass away from the center of the club out to its edges, creating a cavity in the back of the club head and an expanded sweet spot. Solheim's ping putters and irons ushered in a new generation of golf equipment. By the 1970s, investment cast irons were common. A decade later, metal woods had replaced their persimmon and laminated predecessors. Advancements in chemistry, aerodynamics, and computer-aided design have continued to help golfers. Today's typical driver has a metal head the size of a grapefruit and a shaft made of graphite, boron, or titanium. Improvements in equipment began to threaten the sanctity of par. The trend started by Trent Jones towards longer and longer layouts continued, occasionally to the point of absurdity. Then one man got a different idea. Pete Dye was an Indianapolis insurance salesman who dabbled one summer in golf course architecture and never turned back.
Pete Dye and his wife, Alice, completed a few modest courses in Indiana in the early 1960s. But it wasn't until 1963, after they'd made an extensive study of the Great Links of Scotland, that Pete came back and began to revolutionize American golf course architecture.
His revolutionary work, the Harbor Town Golf Links, was barely 6,600 yards from the back tees, but it was sheer architectural shrewdness. There were only 35 bunkers, but they were not wasted. Several greens were bulkheaded with railroad ties, an idea straight out of old Prestwick.
Harbor Town violated just about every rule of golf course architecture, but by unanimous consent, it was brilliant.
Harbor Town launched his career. Then, PGA Tour Commissioner Dean Beeman hired him to build the Tournament Players Club at Sawgrass. It was the first of many layouts designed specifically for spectator viewing and to host professional tournaments. It was the ultimate realization of the Pete Dye philosophy of modern course design. In the 1970s, women's professional golf was evolving at a breakneck pace as Kathy Whitworth won 82 events. Judy Rankin became the first to win $100,000 in a season. And Joanne Carner added a major dash of color, not to mention 2 U.S. Opens. But it was the arrival of Nancy Lopez that brought women's golf to the forefront.
Her dad would not let her wash dishes when she was growing up because he felt like her hands were made for golf. Her dad could see the talent there. I think everybody could. She was just tremendous.
Her rookie year was nothing short of phenomenal. She won 9 times, including 5 straight, and earned more prize money than any rookie golfer ever, man or woman.
There had been so many questions about whether or not women were too masculine out there playing golf, whether or not they were too focused on golf and not on family. And here was a woman who just had everything that the country wanted to see.
I know one sports writer for the New York Times called her the Spanish Queen because of the way she just sort of floated down the fairway, so serene, so dignified.
The thing that I still remember is there was a Sports Illustrated cover of her with just a wonderful smile, and she had her hand up and the golf club, and she was just having a great time playing golf.
Her career paralleled the LPGA's most significant period of growth, as purses quadrupled and the number of televised events jumped from 2 to 14. But if there was a success story during the last quarter of the 20th century, it was the emergence of the Senior PGA Tour. Golf's greatest mulligan began in 1978 with the Legends of Golf, a made-for-television, 2-man better ball event. From that modest beginning, the Senior PGA Tour mushroomed into a 42-event tour with total prize money of more than $50 million. Now, golf is not only for people of all ages, but also is for people of all countries. Today, the sport is booming in many faraway places and varying climates. In Sweden, they take the game so seriously that all new players must pass a proficiency test. In Japan, the scarcity of land means that only the super rich can afford to actually play. Everyone else is relegated to a driving range. Yes, there are golf courses now where no one would ever have believed possible. The man who started it all was the determined little South African who ranked alongside Nicklaus and Palmer as one of golf's big three, Gary Player. No athlete has logged more miles, no golfer has won more events worldwide. 9 of those wins are major championships. The most dramatic of Player's majors was his last, the 1978 Masters, where he birdied 7 of his final 10 holes for a 64 that took the title by 1 stroke. The exuberant young man who hugged Gary Player on that 72nd green would become his successor on the world stage. Seve Ballesteros was born in the village of Pedreña on the northern coast of Spain. He was the youngest of 4 brothers, all of whom were golf professionals.
He had such wondrous skills. He says that he got these skills because he only had 1 golf club, a 3-iron, which isn't the most versatile of golf clubs. And he learned, he had a couple of old balls and he was on the beach, and you make your own little golf course, and you make like a rabbit hole in the ground, and you chip into this one from 30 or 40 yards, and he played for a few pesetas.
Short of the game.
And that's how you learn, and that's how he could do anything with a club.
Okay.
Seve has won 5 majors and in the process set in motion a shift in golf's international balance of power.
It obviously gave a lot of encouragement to other youngsters, because in Spain, golf is very much a rich sport, as it was on a lot of continents of Europe. But when they see somebody who's come up from fairly humble beginnings really make good, it encourages them to take up the game.
The most telling evidence has come in the Ryder Cup, where Great Britain had been America's whipping boy for half a century, with only 3 wins in 23 encounters. But since 1985, Europe has won 5 of 7 matches. With virtually every contest a cliffhanger, the Ryder Cup has become golf's most electrifying event. But by no means has the awakening been confined to Europe. From Queensland, Australia, came an extraordinarily gifted player, the great white shark, Greg Norman. A 2-time British Open champion, he became the first player to surpass $10 million in earnings on the course. But he's made 10 times that off the sport and business ventures, becoming golf's phenom of the global marketing age. When he came to America, the pros were playing for total purses of $17 million a year. Today, the PGA Tour is an international circuit playing for more than $100 million, and Norman has been both a catalyst and a beneficiary of that explosion. But these days, every aspect of golf is more visible than ever before. Not a weekend goes by when the game isn't beamed into our living rooms. There are more golf publications than ever before, and the stores are glutted with books and videos on how to play the game. Commerce in all areas has soared. Yes, golf is hot. And now, for the first time, it's also cool. Eldrick Tiger Woods was gripping a club before he could walk, and by the time he was 2, he was playing the game. One day, he listed the age of Jack Nicklaus when Jack won each championship for the first time. These would be Tiger's goals, to do what Nicklaus did, only sooner. In 1994, he came from 5 holes down in the final match of the U.S. Amateur to win. He was 18 years old, 1 year younger than Nicklaus and the youngest ever to win the championship. But Nicklaus had won the Amateur twice by the time he was 21. So what did Tiger do? He won it 3 times by the age of 20, 3 times in a row, a feat that no one, not even the great Bobby Jones, had managed to pull off. By the time he turned pro a few weeks later, Tiger Woods was a rich young man.
He's got the kind of gifts that make his peers on the practice range stop and watch him hit shots. There's something special going on there. And as a result, the promise and the anticipation and all the expectations that are heaped upon him are actually, very logical.
With $100 million in endorsements, he gave his sponsors their money's worth, winning twice in his first 7 starts. And yet, by his own reckoning, he hadn't even played his best. That was saved for April of 1997. He won the Masters, his first major as a professional, by a record-breaking 12 strokes. He was 21 years old, 2 years younger than Nicklaus. At the same time that Tiger broke records at Augusta, he broke barriers.
This youngster has captured everybody's imagination. And black, white, pink, green, I don't care what the colors are. As long as you can play the game, you're going to be their hero. And that's what Tiger has done for the game.
It's been a long, long time since we've had the focus on the game, and people are literally coming into the game by the thousands. You know, Tiger Woods is a household name.
Certainly the fact that he's of a multi-ethnic background symbolically means a great deal to a lot of people who were never connected to golf before. And so he's a champion for them.
There isn't anybody probably in the world, or in America certainly, that wouldn't say, you know, I can play golf. If I want to play golf, I can play golf. And that's a good thing.
Golf has been encumbered with a lot of baggage, social baggage, for most of my lifetime. But I see it dissipating, and I think I see the reason. I think people are willing now to, and even golfers and old world golfers are willing to concede that there's racism, there's sexism, there's elitism, that's part of the fabric of the game. But when you strip that away, and it's possible to strip it away, what you're left with is a wonderful game.
The story of golf. No one knows exactly where it began. No one could have imagined what it has become.
I think that if you were to take somebody like Charles McDonald and just transpose him into the late 20th century, he'd take a look at the game and say, seems to be a bit easier. The bunkers aren't as severe, the conditions aren't as severe, but I can relate to that game, and I'm sure that he would do well, because the game is essentially the same.
Its tantalizing lure, its transfixing appeal are as timeless as the game itself.
You've only got to hit one shot in the middle of the club and you're hooked. And that feeling then stays with you for the rest of your life.
I've said this many times, it's like a butterfly. You just think you've caught it, and it flies away.
It's so maddening and it's so addictive. And I think in those elements you find the greatness of the game.
Today, this game involving a stick, a ball, and a hole in the ground is played in 80 different nations on more than 25,000 courses by close to 50 million people. That's right, 50 million people play this sport, a sport that increases the blood pressure, ruins the disposition, spoils digestion, hurts the eyes, calluses the hands, makes liars out of honest men, and fools out of everyone.
We'll always keep coming back because each of us wants to somehow have that magic round that transcends all the others. It's what motivated Arnold Palmer and Jack Nicklaus, and it's what motivates you and me. Golf can't be beaten.
The future of golf seems boundless, royal and ancient and utterly irresistible. It's truly the game of a lifetime.